Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the System Center Configuration Manager 2012 Fundamentals lesson in the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager training course. We'll kick this lesson off with a look at System Center Configuration Manager in general, quickly followed up by a look at what's new in this latest edition of the product. From there, we'll take a licensing bent and take a look at some of the terminology that's important to understand with regard to licensing Configuration Manager and System Center. Just as important is how you license the product beyond the terminology, so that will be the next part of this lesson. From there, we'll move on to a discussion about the various roles that are available in the product and understand what each one of them does. There are a lot of different reasons that organizations deploy Configuration Manager 2012 into the environment. For Global Mantics, the company wants to streamline their operations, so your job by the end of this lesson is to learn what makes System Center Configuration Manager tick. Your next goal is to learn what's new in System Center Configuration Manager. There's a lot of new features and functionality in this product, and we won't discover all of it necessarily in this lesson, but we'll discover it throughout this course and focus on the high points in this lesson, including some of the themes that you're going to find throughout the System Center product line, including Configuration Manager 2012. And because buying System Center Configuration Manager and System Center in general is such an important step in the implementation process, a deep understanding for how System Center is licensed is really critical, particularly because this is one of the biggest areas of change in this latest version of the product. And we'll learn about some fundamentals, including those roles we talked about Configuration Manager. Gaining this fundamental view of Configuration Manager will help you be more successful in your overall Configuration Manager journey. But beyond just the stuff that's going to help you out, there's some stuff that's going to help the business. You're going to gain high-level Configuration Manager knowledge to begin implementing it effectively. This is really critical. You don't want to walk into this blind. Configuration Manager is a pretty complex product, and if you don't have some base knowledge that you walk into it with, it can really be a mess at the end of the day. And you'll understand the costs of your Configuration Manager deployment. Nothing is worse than deploying a product and finding out you don't truly understand how much it's going to cost from a licensing perspective. Now, let's discuss System Center Configuration Manager a little bit itself, starting with a couple of very high-level things. First of all, Configuration Manager, often abbreviated SCCM, is just one part of the System Center 2012 product suite. No longer can you purchase System Center Configuration Manager by itself. You have to buy it as a part of the System Center 2012 suite, which includes a number of other products, which we'll discuss later. You may wonder why it's abbreviated SCCM and not CM or SC 2012 CM. Well, those other abbreviations would really not help much in Google. CM is going to get you lots of stuff, and SC 2012 CM, really nobody's using. It's often, and for a very long time, the product has been abbreviated SCCM or Config MGR, or Configuration Manager. Those two abbreviations seem to be moving forward as well, even with the product's new name. It used to be System Center Configuration Manager 2007, for example. Now the product is called System Center 2012 Configuration Manager. And that's a key difference. So it's important to understand that the shortcuts really don't seem to have changed much, and if you're doing Google searches to help you learn more about the product, those other abbreviations will still work. Configuration Manager provides support for both servers and clients, but the focus is really on the end user and associated computing devices. The real focus of Configuration Manager is really the client, even though it does have some server functionality, for example, patching servers. With the whole of the System Center 2012 product line, Microsoft is really focusing more on the user centricity of their products, making them friendly to end users, and we'll see this throughout this course as you'll see some of the items that Microsoft has packed into this 2012 edition of Configuration Manager, items that are really friendly to end users. In fact, if you look at the product page for System Center 2012, especially for Configuration Manager, you're going to notice that it says deliver and manage rich user experiences across corporate and consumer devices. This tells you exactly where Microsoft is going with a number of their products, most specifically Configuration Manager. They want to make sure that the end user experience on both company-provided and bring your own device or personal products is as deep and robust as it possibly can be. System Center Configuration Manager works with a well-defined process. First of all, you start by scanning and inventorying all managed devices. And devices can include desktops, laptops, servers, and even some smartphones. And that's really a key thing these days, especially with the bring your own device revolution that's either plaguing or a boon to IT departments depending on your perspective. Next up, client software is deployed to supported devices. This client software tracks software and hardware components that are available on that client device, streamlines software deployment, and manages the patching process for the full patch lifecycle. Now, when we talk about tracking software and hardware components, Configuration Manager actually keeps a historical snapshot of software and hardware changes on each device, so that if you're having trouble with something, you can easily go back and see what may have caused the problem. With Configuration Manager, you can also do bare metal operating system deployments. And what this means is you can deploy brand new systems to people's desktops from scratch without having to do anything first on the actual desktop machine to be deployed. You can put it out there, and Configuration Manager can do the rest. We actually have a full lesson devoted to operating system deployments in this course. Another key change you're going to find in Configuration Manager 2012 is the fact that the product that used to be called Forefront Endpoint Protection is now just called Endpoint Protection, and it's now integrated into Configuration Manager much more deeply than it was before. In fact, it's a part of the product. Through settings management, systems can be monitored to determine their compliance with established baselines. This helps you make sure the machines don't drift too far from what you consider a normal baseline. The more machines drift from baseline configurations, the higher the risk for outages and an unhappy end user because of things that are not working as expected. Through settings management, you can help make sure that machines don't stray too far from the established norms. So what's new in Configuration Manager 2012? Well, there's a lot, and we're going to touch on a number of items here. First of all, as I mentioned, Microsoft is taking a much more user-centric approach to many of their tools than they ever did in the past. And a lot of this has to do with the IT revolution that's taking place right now, called Bring Your Own Device. Now, it's not just BYOD that's causing this, but everything that's happening in the world of IT is really starting to take a user-focused approach. And after all, that really makes sense because users are the ones that are the customers or clients of the services that are provided by IT. So taking a user-centric management approach makes a lot of sense, particularly if you can deploy even more and more self-service type applications so that users don't even have to engage IT on a regular basis. This is good for both the end user, who can get their job done more quickly, and good for IT because then IT can focus on more value-add activities to the business rather than supporting mundane tasks like software deployments. You're going to see a lot of improved application management features in Configuration Manager 2012, including the addition of an application catalog that we'll be talking about in a lesson later in this course. With this addition of Configuration Manager, SQL Server Replication is responsible for handling content distribution. It used to be the System Center made use of a relatively archaic process to do this, although it still retains some of that archaicity with regard to software packages, patches, and OS images. Other types of content, however, are replicated using SQL Server Replication. This is a new feature that's called the System Center Unified Installer, and it is more difficult to use than just a typical installer. I have given it every chance in the world, and I don't understand, to be quite frank, how it makes life easier. We won't be looking at it very much in this course. We'll be using the native application installation process, but understand that there's now a unified installer tool that can help you to install any of the applications that are available in the System Center 2012 suite. With Configuration Manager 2012, the console has been revamped, and you're going to see a very different console than you used to see in the past. There are no more mixed and native modes in Configuration Manager 2012. Instead, communication takes place via HTTP and HTTPS, and this is as it should be. Life is much easier without this concept of mixed and native mode constantly getting in the way. And it's much easier for people to use a mechanism that they use for many other services as well, and that would be HTTP and HTTPS. Configuration Manager 2012 also includes a software portal that your users will probably find very useful, and we'll be dedicating a good chunk of a lesson later in this course to discovering how to use that software portal. There's another new feature in Configuration Manager 2012 called Conditional Delivery. And this feature actually tries to determine what kind of device a user is using, whether it be a virtual machine, a terminal server, a mobile device, or a traditional desktop or laptop, and help make sure that applications can follow the user in a way that makes sense for that particular device. So if they're using a machine that can't handle a particular application, it won't be deployed in a way that doesn't make sense for that particular machine. We'll be working with conditional delivery later in this course, but it's a great new feature in Configuration Manager 2012. With conditional delivery, the product also attempts to determine an application delivery method, whether that's streaming the application to the device, publishing it on a presentation server, or traditionally deploying the software to a particular endpoint, such as a desktop. For example, for publishing it on a presentation server, that may be useful in a bring your own device scenario with an iPad or something like that, because then you could use a remote desktop connection to connect to that presentation server to consume that particular application. Or, if you're on a desktop, a traditional software deployment makes much more sense. For those of you keeping score, there are also lots of role changes that have come with Configuration Manager 2012. There is no more reporting point. The old reporting point is gone forever, probably. And that's gone in favor of the reporting services point. And this is something, a direction Microsoft has been making for a long time. And it's basically moving all reporting from Configuration Manager itself into SQL Server reporting services. So the reporting point is gone, but the reporting services point lives on. The Pixie service point is now gone in favor of a distribution point. The Pixie service point was used to provide boot services in older versions of Configuration Manager. That functionality has moved to a distribution point. And what used to be called the server locator point has moved into the management point role. There's no more need for the server locator point. So, it's definitely a case of out with the old and in with the new. And there are a number of new roles that are available in Configuration Manager 2012. First up, we have the Software Center, which is encompassed by two different points or roles that you're going to find in Configuration Manager 2012. First of all, we have the Application Catalog Website point and the Application Catalog Web Services point. One is a front-end application used by the end user to choose software. The second one is a back-end application that's used by Configuration Manager to manage the application catalog. In order to support mobile devices, we now have 2 points that we have to add, the enrollment proxy point and the enrollment point. One manages requests from mobile devices to be added to the Configuration Manager umbrella. The second completes the mobile device enrollment. And again, this idea of mobile and user centricity is very big in Configuration Manager 2012, as evidenced by the addition of 3 roles focused on end user and mobile devices. Now that we've talked about a lot of the new features you're going to find in Configuration Manager 2012, let's move on to the fun stuff, licensing. If you want to go get a cup of coffee, that's okay. Licensing is never fun, but it's important to understand. The first term on your list is not necessarily a licensing term, but it's one that I included here because I think that you need to understand that a role with Configuration Manager creates a server that's a Configuration Manager server. So if you've got 30 servers out there, each with a single role, there are 30 Configuration Manager servers in your environment. Now that may not make a huge difference, but it's still important to understand. A role is a discrete set of functionality, such as the software distribution point or the reporting services point that we talked about before. This extends the product's functionality in some key way. The next term, operating system environment, is really important to understand, and you're going to find this everywhere in Microsoft's documentation these days, not just System Center. An OSE, or an operating system environment, is an instance of an operating system, including any applications configured to run on it. This can be a physical or a virtual operating system. For example, A Hyper-V host is a single OSE without any running virtual machine. Each virtual machine that's running inside that Hyper-V host is also an OSE. So let's say you've got a Hyper-V host running 6 virtual machines. You have 7 operating system environments, the host and 6 virtual machines. A client, in the sense of configuration manager, is generally a desktop or an end-user device of some kind. A management license. There's a couple different management licenses that you need to think about with configuration manager. The first one is a server management license, and this is a configuration manager license that's assigned to a server. Or a configuration manager license that's assigned to a client is a client management license. And we're going to talk a little bit more about management licenses later in this lesson. So let's try to understand some of what's going on here with configuration manager licensing overall. Don't forget, configuration manager is no longer licensed as a standalone product. You can't go to Microsoft and say, I want configuration manager and just configuration manager. You get much more. When you're buying System Center 2012 now, you're buying all of the products you see in this chart, including Virtual Machine Manager, Operations Manager, Service Manager, App Controller, Orchestrator, Data Protection Manager, and Endpoint Protection. And this could be good or bad depending on your perspective. You may not want all this stuff, but you're going to get it now when you buy System Center 2012. Now, understanding that you can't buy Configuration Manager by itself, let's look at the 2 editions that you can buy System Center 2012 in. The first one is called the Data Center Edition, and this is licensed per 2 processors. And you can run as many operating system environments as you want on machines that are licensed by a Data Center Edition of System Center 2012. Or you can buy a Standard Edition, which is licensed per 2 managed operating system environments. So if you buy a Standard Edition license, you can manage 2 operating system environments. So let's take a look at what this means in all practical terms. You're probably going to be using this in a virtual environment of some kind. Here are some examples. Suppose you're running a system with 2 processors and 1 managed operating system environment. This would require 1 data center management license or 1 standard management license for a cost of, as you can see on your screen. Now, let's also suppose you're running a system with 2 processors or 3 operating system environments. This would require that you buy 1 data center management license or 2 standard management licenses. Notice you can't buy 1.5 standard management licenses. You cannot split the management licenses across multiple servers. And the last example shows you that there's a break-even somewhere here, where it makes more sense to buy the Data Center Edition than it does the Standard Edition. If you have a 4-processor server running 16 operating system environments, which is not outside the realm of possibility if you're running vSphere or Hyper-V, you need to buy either 2 Data Center Management licenses or 8 Standard Management licenses. And you can see that the cost for the 8 Standard Management licenses is much greater than the cost for the Data Center Management licenses. Don't forget, you don't have to be running Hyper-V in order to take advantage of the Data Center Edition. It works perfectly fine if you buy a Data Center Edition and you're running vSphere. Microsoft allows you to run third-party hypervisors and still take advantage of the data center licensing. By the way, it's important to understand that the break-even point is 7 virtual machines, around that for most cases, and you do not need to separately license SQL Server. You can use the SQL Server runtime license, basically, to run Configuration Manager and the other System Center 2012 products without having to separately license SQL Server. So from that perspective, the product is much less expensive than it would normally be if you had to license SQL Server, because SQL Server can be a lot of money to license. So just to reiterate, you cannot split management licenses across multiple servers. The break-even point for the Data Center Management license is 7 virtual machines, and there's no separate SQL Server licensing necessary in Configuration Manager or the other System Center products. Now there's also client licensing. We just talked about servers. Now if you're going to be managing end-user clients, desktop machines for example, you have to buy some licenses. First of all, you have the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager Client Management License, and this supports Configuration Manager and Virtual Machine Manager. Now remember, System Center 2012 is a suite of products. So these management licenses support multiple products in that suite. When you buy the Configuration Manager Client Management License, you enable functionality in Configuration Manager and Virtual Machine Manager for the low list price of $62 per machine. You also have a System Center 2012 Endpoint Protection Client Subscription License. This supports endpoint protection, which is managed by Configuration Manager for $22 per machine. Again, these are list prices. You hopefully are in a Microsoft licensing program and are not paying anywhere near list price for the products. Then you have a System Center Client Management Suite Client Management License, which is used by Service Manager, Operations Manager, and Data Protection Manager for a list price of $121. We won't be discussing this license or those products in this lesson or this course, but understand that there's a third management license that can get you additional functionality from the various System Center 2012 components. If you are in a Microsoft Enterprise licensing agreement, there's a concept of Core and Enterprise Client Access Licenses, or CALs, that are available under these volume licensing programs. The Core CAL suite includes the Configuration Manager Client Management License and the Endpoint Protection Client License that you're going to need. If you have an Enterprise CAL suite, all licenses are available, so you don't need to actually take any steps to buy additional client licenses if you have an Enterprise CAL suite associated with your volume license agreement with Microsoft. And now, the disclaimer. Anytime you talk about Microsoft licensing, things can and will change and are subject to interpretation. I've actually spent a lot of time studying Microsoft licensing, so I consider myself pretty good at it. However, there's always a question that is like a gray area. Always consult your Microsoft sales rep or your Microsoft partner to ask those hard questions, because you don't want to mess up licensing. Bad things can happen if licensing is done incorrectly. I mentioned before that there were lots of different roles you could add to Configuration Manager to extend the product's capabilities. Well, here's a few. There are some base roles that you're going to have regardless of what kind of Configuration Manager deployment you're using. Then we'll talk about some of the extended roles in just a minute. First of all, we have the site server, and this is the computer on which you actually run the Configuration Manager setup program. This provides the core functionality for the site server. The site database server, as you might expect, is the server that hosts SQL Server, and this stores all the information about Configuration Manager assets and site data. It's a pretty key base role. Next up, we have a component server. This also runs a number of Configuration Manager services, and when you install all the site system roles except the distribution point role, the Configuration Manager automatically installs the component server. So whenever you install any role except the distribution point, you get a component server role associated along with it. And this is basically telling Configuration Manager that this is a component server to the Configuration Manager implementation. Next up, we have a management point, and this is a role that provides policy and service location information to clients, and it receives configuration data from clients. So a management point is really used, heavily leveraged by Configuration Manager to help Configuration Manager work its magic. Next up, we have a distribution point, which is a system role that contains source files for clients to download, such as application content, software packages, software updates, operating system images, and boot images. So when you deploy software updates, they're deployed to a distribution point, at which point they're deployed out to clients eventually. But the distribution point handles the heavy lifting of making sure the clients get the software and services that they need. The reporting services point is a site role that integrates with SQL Server reporting services to create and manage reports for Configuration Manager. You'll see reporting pretty deeply in this course. We then have a state migration point, and this is used to store user data when a computer is migrated to a new operating system. For example, you move from Windows XP to Windows 7. Users want to maintain their settings and their documents and all that good stuff. That's the job of the state migration point. A software update point is used to integrate with Windows Server Update Services, or WSUS, to provide software updates to Configuration Manager clients. Next up, we have a number of extended roles that we'll be looking at, some of these at least, throughout this course. We won't do a lot with the System Health Validator point, but we will do a lot with endpoint protection. And this is a site system role the Configuration Manager will use to accept the endpoint protection license terms and to configure the default membership for Microsoft Active Protection Services. The fallback status point is used to help you monitor client installation and identify clients that might be having issues with communicating with their management server. An out-of-band service point is used is a site system role that helps provision and configure the Intel Advanced Management Technology-based computers for out-of-band management. And this is useful for computers that are unresponsive to their operating system. If a computer is armed with Intel's advanced management technologies, it may be possible for Configuration Manager to still be able to control that computer through this Intel add-in. The Asset Intelligence Synchronization Point is a site system role that connects to System Center Online, which is, as it sounds like, Microsoft's constantly updated System Center information site, to download Asset Intelligence catalog information and upload uncategorized titles so they can be considered for future inclusion in the catalog. Microsoft is constantly keeping the catalog current, so your uncategorized titles will be sent to them for categorization. The Application Catalog Web Services Point is a site system role that provides software information to the Application Catalog website from the software library. Again, sort of behind the scenes, as I mentioned before. The Application Catalog website point is a site system role that provides users with a list of available software from the Application Catalog. This is the end-user facing role. And we talked before about the Enrollment Proxy point and the Enrollment Point. These are a couple of resources that might help you a little bit when it comes to understanding some of the concepts that we discussed in this lesson. In particular, I would highly recommend that you read the licensing and pricing frequently asked questions that you see on this page. We started this lesson with a look at Configuration Manager itself. From there, we looked at what's new in Configuration Manager 2012 and talked about some of the terminology associated with the product's licensing. We then looked at the licensing itself with a couple of examples and made sure that there's an understanding of some of the SCCM roles that are available in the product. It's okay if you didn't quite get all of the roles yet, because you're going to see most of these roles in action at some point throughout this course. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.